Welcome to No Apologies. I'm Dana Lash. Now, as you know, it was the 20th year observance of 9/11 on Saturday. And as it moves, at least time-wise, into the distant past, it's easy for newer generations to forget the horror of that event. The death toll on that fall morning was 2,977 people. Most of the fatalities were civilians, 344 firefighters, however, 71 law enforcement officers, and 55 military personnel were also killed. Much of the 9/11 imagery is incredibly gruesome, so I just prefer that we don't show it to you because you know the idea and you've probably seen some of it. As shocking as the attack was, equally shocking was this collective realization that there was an ideology that could drive 19 young men to hijack planes and blow themselves up and take out as many innocent people as possible. And that ideology was and is radical Islam. It's an ideology that continues to thrive and accounts for the vast majority of terror attacks worldwide. So if we list the deadly terror attacks carried out by both radical Islamists here and in Europe, within the ensuing 20 years, it would take days of this broadcast to do it, days upon days, weeks probably. And the point is this: radical Islamic terrorism is by far and away the #1 threat to the world. And in terms of terrorism, it's the threat. It's the threat. I mean, that's 9/11. Now, again, anyone alive on 9/11, everybody knows the sheer terror that the country felt collectively that day. Nothing comes close. We watched it all play out on live television together, and we all felt helpless, and we all felt confused, and nobody knew what was happening. And all this to say, a very disgusting point of view has emerged over the weekend from some far-left pundits and a candidate down in Florida. They're attempting to make a comparison between, get this, 9/11 and January 6th, the day of the Capitol riot. Yeah, so that can't pass. We can't let that go because it's too important to stop a lie like that from gaining traction and taking root. The comparison's offensive. First, let's take a look at what Jonathan Capehart, whoever he is, of MSNBC. He's on MSNBC, though. What he had to say. This is unbelievable. This guy, is he a host or is he a contributor? I don't even know because I don't ever watch the channel. He says that Trump supporters are more worrisome than the Taliban or even ISIS. He says this on 9/11. Watch.
I think MAGA and the domestic terror threat is much more worrisome than any foreign threat we could face.
How well do you think that he would fare over in the streets of Kabul speaking his opinion against, I don't know, say the Taliban, and over here in the United States speaking his opinion against the Taliban? Let's see. First of all, can we have an observance of 9/11 without using it to score political points? Can we have that at all? Come on, it's been 20 years. It's disgusting to leap from 9/11 to a comparison with the Capitol riot, and that was the context of their discussion. But just a couple points on this. First, if there was a turn away from democracy in America, it began well before the Capitol riot. I mean, let's not forget that we also had Democrats bomb the Senate office, if you want to have a discussion about rioting and about criminal activity and domestic terrorism at the Capitol. But we just don't ever mention that, do we? Google it and you'll see for yourself. No, this began way before. It began when Democrats and legacy press could not accept the results of the 2016 election. So they decided to launch a special counsel based on the lie of Russian interference, which they never proved, and for 4 years used it to attempt not just to destroy and impeach without any criminal charges the president at every turn, but they wanted to destroy the integrity of the institutions in which we invest our consent of authority through voting. So Democrats for 4 years demonstrated their disdain for actual democracy, and they ignored the democratic outcomes that happened on 2016. So this allegation that this is all new, this didn't start on January 6th, but far more ridiculous than that statement from Capehart saying, quote, "I think MAGA and the domestic terror threat is much more worrisome than any foreign threat that we could face," end quote. Nobody challenged him on this. That's the other thing that's disgusting. Nobody challenged him on this statement. See, there's this narrative that has been embraced. Actually, it was encouraged, began on the left, it's been encouraged and since embraced by the Biden administration that January 6th was a coup attempt and we nearly lost our democracy. No, what Biden allowed to have happen as we left Kabul, that was a coup. That was an insurrection. This was a riot of a bunch of people who shouldn't have been rioting. See, that's the consistency of people like us on the right. They shouldn't have been up there because that's my house too. I paid taxes on that, right? I mean, I get mad if you put something down on a wood surface without a coaster. Now, of course, the allegation that this was some kind of insurrection was entirely disproven by the FBI's recent report where they literally said that it wasn't and that it wasn't even organized. By the way, there was not one firearm found on anybody in this riot. There was no coup attempt. That's a lie. Anybody who would say that January 6th was the worst attack in American history, they don't apparently understand American history, and that the president and legacy media keep perpetuating this fable for the purpose of division. Even after the FBI's report, it tells you everything you need to know. This is a political tool that they're using to continue to divide and stoke animosity towards people they don't like politically. 2,977 people died instantly on 9/11 versus one Capitol Hill rioter who was killed, Ashley Babbitt, who we never even got details on the exact circumstances other than what we were able to see on video, and a guy who was didn't know where he was pointing at. Rule number 1 of firearms, know your target, know what's behind it. There was a whole SWAT team behind his target. On 9/11, one plane also struck the Pentagon and the famous, of course, can't forget, Flight 93 in Shanksville. Its destination, well, what was reported is that it was the White House. Now, I'm making the point. These events cannot be compared. And don't forget Benghazi either. 11 years later, Benghazi, another terror attack. Another point of difference, too, the 9/11 terrorist plot was planned by terrorist enemies over many years. January 6th was a spontaneous riot, clearly, but yet, I mean, the FBI again tells us this, and it's a leftist FBI, the same FBI that was also working to undermine, again, our institutions and actually even trying to get wiretaps abusing FISA court, using discredited Russian Oppo that they wouldn't even actually confirm or verify because they said it was unverifiable. But yet again, all the people on the left, they want us to believe that the Capitol riot is in any way comparable to 9/11. How disrespectful are you to sit here and diminish the loss of thousands of people and everything their families are going to score a political point? Well, what are you attempting why conflate these two events? What do you want to gain? It has to be said, it's disgusting and it's dangerous. And to roll the average Trump voter into those statements, purposefully conflating, again, those red hats and domestic terrorists is reckless. And it's dangerous. If you notice, there is this concerted effort to blur lots of terminology. A bunch of language and terms get rolled together. White supremacy, MAGA, domestic terrorist. Again, these conflations are incredibly intentional. Now, the MAGA movement may be many things, and I don't care if you disagree with it or not. That's irrelevant. It's never been a violent movement. For the love, it's never been a terrorist movement. It's not that, it wasn't MAGA that burned America for an entire summer. It wasn't MAGA, by the way, that bombed the Senate office. It wasn't MAGA that did Occupy. It wasn't MAGA that decided to destroy college campuses. It wasn't MAGA that burned down Kenosha. It wasn't MAGA that did Louisville also. No, it wasn't any of those people. It's a leftist movement responsible for the constant destruction, arson, vandalism, assault, and murder. MAGA didn't create Chaz Chop, their own little, not really even autonomous area up in Seattle where they couldn't even garden properly. It was like Zoolander trying to garden. They didn't do that. The left did. And see, when Democrats were asked about it, they just said, oh, those people are all a myth. No. And it's still, they called Antifa and elements of the BLM crowd. They just said that they were peaceful protesters. But we know, right? This is not the so-called domestic terrorists that Jonathan Capehart of MSNBC or Homeland Security. No, that's not who they're talking about. Now, as I've said earlier, there have been dozens of terrorist attacks by radical Islamists in America and tens of thousands worldwide. But other than the Capitol riot, which was, again, a spontaneous, unplanned riot by some very foolish people, and those who broke the law, they're getting in trouble. I have no problem with that. But where are these so-called domestic terrorist attacks that they keep warning us about? Let's see the specifics. Who are these groups? Where are the examples of other attacks? It's the #1 threat to America, so I know details. Kind of makes you wonder if they prefer this threat to be nebulous and undefined. That way they can wield that whole domestic terrorist threat as a political weapon. Also, on the observance 20 years of 9/11, some in the media seem to be downplaying 9/11, but dialing up the already overheated rhetoric about January 6th. Why? Here's another example. Former candidate for Congress. I have no idea who this woman is, and I think that the only time she ever gets attention is when she says something stupid on social media, which is all the time. She's some Democrat named Pam Keith, who should have been named Karen, and she tweeted this over the weekend. Quote, she says, on 1/6/2021, 9/11/2001 ceased being the worst thing that happened to America in my lifetime. It's really weird and painful to process and say that, but that's the truth. And quite frankly, it's not even close. End quote. Because that day is all about her, guys. 9/11, the observance of this is all about Pam. Imagine tweeting that. Oh, cringe. On the anniversary of 9/11. I wonder if the families of the nearly 3,000 who lost someone on that day, I wonder if they feel the same as Pam Keith. But to Pam Keith, the Capitol riot is the worst event of her lifetime. One of the worst events of my lifetime is Pam Keith tweeting. Here are two choices. Either Pam Keith is right and the Capitol riot was the worst moment in American history. Lincoln dying, being assassinated, didn't even come close. Not to mention Pearl Harbor. Or Pam Keith is so filled with hatred for Trump voters that she's willing to say something so outrageous we question her sobriety in order to demonize 80 million Americans. And it would be one thing if it was someone just like Pam Keith, we're just going to go with it, or Jonathan Capehart, the Karens of MSNBC, saying something like this. But it's also Joe Biden, the head Karen himself. Now remember, Biden called the Capitol riot, quote, the worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War. I mean, forget about Pearl Harbor. No one cares about that, apparently. And then, of course, 9/11. Oh my gosh, one of the worst things about Biden is that he mainstreams stupid, illiberal, radical left talking points rather than actually refuting them. Because he's so terrified of his sensitive little base. You can't disagree with him because they'll stop supporting you if they disagree with you about one thing. He's adding to the demonization of people by adopting these narratives of white supremacy, domestic terrorists, and even pandemic of the unvaccinated. He's ratcheting up all of the division and hatred that's already kind of, I mean, it's not even at a boiling point. I think it's over the pot at this point. All of these characterizations of Trump voters of America, how many times have we got to do this? Of people who feel like it's their right simply to ask questions, which apparently is unscientific, even though it's like one of the very bases of science. But they want to make different decisions on medical choices and is essentially othering them, making them enemies of the republic. Ironically, it's these people who love this republic the most. But I'm telling you, if we don't stop repeating these narratives, I realize that people would love for us to be at each other's throats, but you don't have to be useful idiots for them. We're backing 80 million Americans into a corner, grouping them together and calling them names, threatening their livelihoods, vilifying them. That's the kind of behavior that precedes violence being done against people. And the president and the media, they should know better, but they don't, because they don't care. Here's my Kanye moment. Now, you know who else doesn't understand the danger of this rhetoric? People like George W. Bush, speaking of Kanye. Look, George W., he was good in the days after 9/11. I vehemently disagreed with Patriot Act and No Child Left Behind and Too Big to Fail and a bunch of other things, but he was very clear that he didn't feel that it was right for him to criticize presidents once he was out of office. And then he was pretty much radio silent about Barack Obama for 8 years. But Donald Trump's tweets. He was really willing to criticize Donald Trump repeatedly because, see, people's tweets is worse than their actions in the old-timey GOP world. Bush seemed awfully quiet during the summer of riots and even affirmed the charge that America was systemically racist. He never seemed to believe that America was systemically racist during his 8 years as president, but now that it's fashionable to denigrate America, and W's never defended his voters the way that some recent Republican presidents have, here he is piling on. And the legacy media loves it. They hate it. Remember when they hated Bush, but if they can use Bush as a cudgel against the Republican Party, they'll love him. But of course, he's gotten, I don't begrudge him for being friends with Obama or Clinton, because I'm not one of those people, I'm not like the left. I don't see issues where people stand. But he seems louder to criticize the right than he does the left, which, if you want to have a discussion, the criticism about George W. Bush, I've crashed protests where people have hung him and burned him in effigy for the love. Seen it with my own eyes, smelled the gas. He's even picked up the talking point that America has a terrible problem with domestic terrorism. Now, is he talking about BLM or Antifa? I'm trying to give him the benefit of the doubt here. He says that these domestic terrorists are just as big of a threat as those who attacked us on 9/11. Watch.
The security measures incorporated into our lives are both sources of comfort and reminders of our vulnerability. And we have seen growing evidence that the dangers to our country can come not only across borders, but from violence that gathers within. There is little cultural overlap between violent extremists abroad and violent extremists at home. But in their disdain for pluralism, in their disregard for human life, in their determination to defile national symbols, they are children of the same foul spirit, and it is our continuing duty to confront them.
Now, as I said, if you wanted to be generous, you could think, okay, maybe Bush is talking about BLM or Antifa. I mean, that would be entirely accurate, but it's really hard to come to that conclusion based on some of his past remarks. So it seems like he's kind of playing into the same narrative that's being peddled by Homeland Security and the Biden administration and the legacy press. And that message is that MAGA, Trump voters, are not just a bunch of people who feel left behind, unheard, and forgotten in this country, but in fact, they're a danger to the country and they're an enemy within. They're fifth pillar. They're a lot like the Taliban, in fact. And if that's really what Bush was meaning, then he's become a useful idiot for the left. And I hate to see people who always look for validation, politically or otherwise, with the left. And they think that they can't be comfortable in their beliefs unless they're justified by the left. And if they're never justified by the left, they can disregard them. Cool kid mentality. So the price of admission is to adopt the talking points of the left if you want to get in their club. Like America is systemically racist, Trump voters are domestic terrorists, and conflate and equate the threat of radical Islamic terror with made up or unproven domestic terror threats. Bush knows better. I mean, for the love, was anyone ever subjected to the kind of vitriol he was? I mean, maybe Reagan, but it was a whole new level before him. I mean, at least in our modern era. By the way, to be sure, there are domestic terror threats. There always have been. And many have been, like I said, from the left. Groups like the Weather Underground, the leftists who bombed the Senate building, the radical elements of Occupy and BLM, and of course, Antifa. And there are always cranks, always psychos out there, like the far leftist Bernie Sanders campaign volunteer who tried to assassinate Steve Scalise and many other Republican congressmen. And by the way, a hit list was found. And of course, included on that, he was complaining about health care and Republicans. And you know what? They sometimes come from the right, too. With any large group of people, you're always going to have something like that. But this is not the narrative. The narrative is that the domestic terror threat to America is apparently very specifically MAGA or the maggots or whatever the left likes to call them. These unvaccinated, unwashed cretins, except there's a lot of people that don't fit that whole stereotype that are vaccine hesitant, not anti-vax. And to compare September 11 to January 6 in order to refute that narrative is absolutely reprehensible. So whether Bush meant to or not, he added fuel to the fire again, and the proof was the left celebrated his words all over social media. He trended. They loved him. The left loves Bush now, just like they now love Romney after they made up stories about him putting a dog on top of his car and cutting another kid's hair when he was in school. But again, we need people like President Bush to take the harder, braver position. And what position in that is that? That in America, we don't demonize people that vote differently or have different politics, no matter how much we disagree. Remember Ellen and George W. Bush becoming friends? And how the left was freaking out? You don't see the right freaking out like that just because someone on the right wants to be friends with someone on the left. We don't take a riot and we don't extrapolate out of that and blame 80 million people for it. And it's a bad look, which is why, by the way, I've always been super careful when I talk about legitimate BLM protests, like the ones before they got hijacked in Ferguson by the commies coming in from Chicago, and Antifa-run BLM riots. It would be nice to have that consistency, dedication, strong work, and attention to detail from the left. But see, here's the thing. It's like the left expects the working class to serve them while they work from home during a pandemic, to constantly demonize that working class. But if you want to know why all of this is happening, take a look at this poll. It reveals a lot. Democrats were asked what they currently are most worried about. And they said that their number one worry literally was Donald Trump supporters. This is a Rasmussen survey. Holy wow. Number two, unvaccinated Americans, even though you have CDC's Rochelle Walensky, who says that the vaccinated also spread it. So it's a pandemic of everyone. Actually, it's a communist China pandemic. And the Communist Chinese Party successfully got everyone to be useful idiots and go at each other's throats and blame each other instead of them. Good job. The Taliban in China, actual real life threats, they came in at a distant third. These false narratives that white supremacy is everywhere, MAGA as some kind of domestic terrorist threat, and the pandemic of the unvaccinated, these narratives aren't coming from nowhere. These narratives are born of Democrat elites' greatest fear, you. They fear you. They don't want to understand you. They think they do, but they don't. And they want to demonize you. And they want everyone to look at you not as a person with a face and a name and a family, but as just an issue. Charlie Brown's teacher. And the legacy media runs with these narratives because they hate the average American. Honestly, I believe they do. I've been through this too long. Everything I've ever said, including when I said that they love violence, yeah, they do because it sells their shows. And they can disagree with me all they want to, but they know I'm right. No, they see themselves as superior to you. the people on television. By the way, here's them admitting it. It's a great example. Brian Stelter on CNN. This is a tweet from him. He wants you to know that the leadership that carried America through that tragic fall day 20 years ago were people like him. He wasn't even on air at the time, but yes, him. Journalist. Not that Brian is a journalist. It wasn't President Bush. It wasn't the firemen or the police. It wasn't Rudy Giuliani who was there answering press queries at ground zero. It wasn't the governor there. No, it wasn't the first responders, leaders who carried us through 9/11. No, it was the television anchors. Those were the leaders that pulled us through. His tweet reads, quote, network TV anchors were the closest thing that America had to national leaders on 9/11. They were the moral authority for the country on that first day, especially with political leaders in bunkers or elsewhere out of sight, end quote. That coming from the network that rehabilitated, replatformed a guy who was caught masturbating on Zoom with no pants on in front of female colleagues, and then they brought him back to talk about it for a news segment for 10 minutes, and now they consider him a legitimate resource to talk about women's issues. No joke. If you want to know how Brian Stelter, Jeffrey Tubin, by the way, if you want to know how Brian Stelter views himself, that tells you everything. And the fact that he says this when journalism is dead and his network helped kill it, it says a lot. Legacy Press is now 100% partisan. There have actually been surveys done on this, but you get the idea. It's dedicated to spreading actual disinformation. Like the unvaccinated, it's a pandemic of them, that's a true threat to America. And spreading these very lies like this on the 20th anniversary of this awful moment in American history is reprehensible. But what do you expect from the media? But from a former Republican president, I mean, it's frankly stunning. And it shows you just how much the political chessboard is being scrambled right now in America. I'll end on this. While President Bush, Biden, and Obama and Clinton were all busy, actually Bush wasn't there. He wasn't there originally in one of the other pictures. In fact, that's Bloomberg there. So you had all the Democrats. They were making a very public display of unity on 9/11. Bush was elsewhere. In fact, he was in Pennsylvania. And it was a ceremony in which Biden made no remarks, by the way. While they were doing that, here's what President 45 was doing. Trump made a surprise visit to the New York police and fire departments to thank the heroes and the leaders that got us through 9/11 and continue to make our country work every day. And maybe this is why our corrupt media run with this completely just ridiculous impugnation of American character. Narratives about Trump voters, portraying them as diseased white supremacists to the threats to the republic. And that's why they conflate all of this. And they miss the real threat, the continuing threat from radical Islam that played out so tragically on 9/11. Because there's something else the elite on the left, the Marxists, really are afraid of besides you. It's that the average American has rejected them and their false narratives. So coming up, big government and vax mandates. Dr. Fauci, this is very interesting. He wants coronavirus mandates to get on planes now, even though he previously didn't want them, previously didn't think that masks actually were effective, and then said just eat a healthy diet, etc. And then, of course, Secretary Blinken finally has to answer for the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan. Liz Wheeler joins us next. Stay with us. How much equity do you have in your home? Cybercrime experts are alerting homeowners that the more equity they have, the greater the chance criminals will target them. Home title theft is one of the fastest growing crimes, and Home Title Lock, America's leader in home title protection, warns homeowners that they could potentially be victims and not know it. Cyber thieves can search hundreds of public databases for high equity homes, and they can find your home's online title, forge your signature stating that you sold your home, take out loans with your equity, insurance, or common identity theft programs. They're not going to cover you. But you can be proactive, protect your most valuable asset, register your address to see if you're already or could potentially be a victim, and receive a complete title history of your home, a $100 value for free. Visit HometitleLock.com.
I would support that if you want to get on a plane and travel with other people, that you should be vaccinated.
The government is vaccine mandate happy, except it's more so working like a therapeutic and not inoculating people. So much for the pandemic of the unvaccinated. So now the discussion is you can't get on a plane, at least they would like to see this, if Fauci has his way. And by the way, why is Fauci weighing in on policy and politics? I mean, just last week it was commissioned the NIH study looking at the effects of the vaccines on women's reproductive health, menstrual cycles. Nobody's asking him that question, not even female reporters. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken is finally having to answer for this just botched withdrawal out of Afghanistan. His answers have been ridiculous. Liz Wheeler, host of The Liz Wheeler Show, joins us now to discuss where these vaccine mandates are heading, the latest out of Afghanistan as well. Liz, good to see you. This is a turnaround for, I don't know where Fauci stands anymore. I have like 8 cuts of audio that I played on radio today, and he went from saying, and you know this because you've been tweeting about this. Actually, I think one of the video clips I got from you, he was saying that, no, we don't need masks. Just eat a healthy diet. You don't need to cover your face. Eat a healthy diet. Get outside in the sunshine. And then it's, well, yes, wear masks. No, wear masks. Now you got to wear no masks for kids in schools. Now masks for kids in schools. Now maybe we should mask on. Yes, mask mandates on an airplane. I can't follow the science with this. Your thoughts?
No, I mean, Fauci is a total fraud. You and I and a few other people have been saying this from the beginning because we saw that Fauci was contradicting himself and ignoring the science from the very beginning. But when it comes to air travel, I mean, Dana, it's really very simple. We just have to ask him, okay, well, what data is this based on? Are people getting sick? Are they transmitting COVID-19 to each other from being on airplanes? And the answer to that is actually no. Ironically enough, even though planes feel disgusting because you're crammed in there like sardines in a jar, it's actually not really a hotbed of COVID transmission. And on CNN just today, Dr. Leanna Wen, who is billed by CNN as an ER physician, but actually she's the former head of Planned Parenthood. So really, I'm not sure why they're having her on talking about saving lives, not really her forte. But she admitted actually that air travel is safe. She admitted that it's not so much a safety measure as it is a tool to coerce people to get vaccinated. And I mean, kudos to her for actually being honest about it. She's a tyrant, she's unscientific, and she's a nut job, but at least she's being honest about the point of vaccine mandates. And Fauci has a history of being manipulative. That's what this is all about. He wants us to get vaccinated. He doesn't care how.
Yeah, that's a good point. My favorite response from Leanna Wen was last week when she was comparing not getting vaccinated to driving drunk, which I don't think that the undrunk or non-drunk catch the drunk from the drunk. Science.
It's completely ridiculous because one's active and one's passive, right? You have no constitutional or fundamental or inherent human right not to die of a pathogen, not to ever contract a virus. I mean, we constantly transmit viruses to each other all the time. That's why people get common colds and sinus infections and the seasonal flu and every other crud that we've ever gotten. Imagine if we actually, in our nation, viewed this as essentially homicide, that when you transmit it to someone else, you're killing them. I mean, this would be an absolutely insane. Only an idiot would even suggest such a thing, and yet these idiots are in charge of our public health and our public policy, unfortunately, and politicians are listening to them. It's nutty.
Last Friday, Liz, Fauci was asked about natural immunity, which is weird that that's never included with anything. Not in the New York vax program, not in, I mean, I think Sweden and maybe a couple of European countries are the only ones who actually include natural immunity on any kind of vax passport. But for some reason, that's not discussed at all here in the United States. And when he was asked about that, he said, oh, I really don't have the answer for you on that. Why? I mean, this would be really a magical virus, Liz, don't you think? If this was the one virus in all of human history where you didn't get natural immunity from it, like chickenpox and everything else, how does he not have answers on this?
Well, he does have answers. He just doesn't want to tell you and tell me, because if we had all the information, we might decide to act in a way differently than how he wants us to act. The truth of the matter is the CDC's own website says that 120.2 million Americans have natural immunity to COVID-19. That number, by the way, hasn't been updated since May. So the number is actually millions and millions higher than that.
Oh, wow.
But the truth of the matter is Fauci believes that if people were exempt from the COVID vaccine because of natural immunity, then people would lie about it. Or maybe not even lie about it. Maybe they believe in good faith that they had it, but they never got antibody tested, so they don't have proof of it. And because he doesn't want people to get out of the vaccine, he doesn't want these exemptions, he's just forcing all these millions of people then to get the vaccine, at least theoretically, because of the few who would lie about natural immunity. So again, it's manipulation. This is what we saw from him last year about the mask, telling us not to wear masks because he wanted to save the PPE, when really he wanted us to wear masks. He was just waiting to mandate it. He's a master manipulator, and this is the latest example.
And he couldn't give an answer about any boosters. And then, of course, the CDC came out. There was a headline today that said Biden and the CDC were at odds over boosters, which I don't understand how that is if we're following the science. The CDC was saying that you're just boosting the sniffles, was the Hills headline on this, which that seems to be a little underreported. And then, Liz, you also have this news that came out last week that the NIH is now, just now, bizarre to me, just now funding studies into the effects of the vaccine on women's reproductive cycles after thousands of women across the country were reporting some pretty dramatic and abnormal changes in their female reproductive health. And yet we're supposed to accept this all as settled science because maybe people like Fauci don't have these concerns. I'm just not sure how people can be faulted for not being as confident as some of the other people who don't have those issues to worry about, like women, when it comes to the effects that this vaccine might have. And that doesn't make us anti-vax, Liz. It just means that isn't one of the basis of scientific discovery and science and the process of it asking questions?
Yeah, that's what science is. I mean, the idea that science is settled is ridiculous to the age-old idea of science. Science is asking questions. I mean, I think we all know women whose periods, whose menstrual cycles were impacted by the vaccine. I certainly know women and girls and young girls, teenage girls, whose periods are greatly different after the vaccine. I know that the plural of anecdote is not data, but when you have these signals of a side effect of a vaccine, of course, it's worth looking into. The problem with the NIH's study, I mean, not only, of course, do we not have the information, but we already know we're not going to be able to trust the information from the NIH when it comes to this study because of the reason they say they're doing the study. They're not doing the study to investigate whether there's a credible, whether this side effect is credible reporting or what the side effect means. They state that they're conducting this study in order to convince people that the side effect is no big deal, that even if your period is heavy for months on end after the vaccine, even if you have different menstrual issues than you had before, that it doesn't matter, it won't actually hurt you. So this is a study with an agenda, which is not science, that's fishing for the answer that they want to help their agenda.
That's a really great point because that's a big difference for people like us who are hoping that, when we first read the announcement before we saw actually what their whole purpose was and what the abstract was going to be, that it was, they were looking into the side effects. Oh no, actually it's just about propaganda, which that's not, I mean, people can't be blamed for not trusting these agencies. So now, of course, the pandemic of the unvaccinated, Liz, can we stop calling it that now? Can we just say everybody's at each other's throats instead of focusing on the CCP, which started all of this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I said last week after President Biden spoke that his speech targeting 80 million Americans who have chosen, they've made the decision themselves, knowing the risks, they've chosen not to take the vaccine. It was the meanest, most vicious, most divisive speech that I've ever heard coming from an American president targeting the American people. I mean, he spoke more harshly about those 80 million Americans who chose not to get the vaccine than he had spoken about the Taliban. It was absolutely shocking. It went from a love thy neighbor to a hate thy neighbor. It was essentially the president of the United States condoning treating 80 million Americans as vermin, as pathogens versus people. And there's going to be repercussions of that. That's a fundamentally anti-American tone of voice for a president who is an elected employee of the American people to talk to his constituents, to talk to his voters, to talk to the American people in that tone of voice. And it is fundamentally American to have skepticism about the government. And if at any point the government tells you not to question them, then you know you ought to be doing it even more.
Yeah, that's the red flag. That's a great point. Whenever they say that you don't need to question them, that's when you really should be pushing it the most. Liz Wheeler, always good to see you, Liz. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Dana. I appreciate it.
All right, folks, Congress returns for a legislative marathon after summer recess. It's going to be a September sprint, but Democrats barely have a majority. Louisiana Congressman Clay Higgins joins us next to discuss. Stay with us. Black Rifle Coffee Company is a veteran-owned coffee company serving premium coffee to people who love America. They develop their explosive roast profiles with the same mission focus that they learned while serving our great nation. And with every purchase you make, Black Rifle Coffee gives back. So in 2020, they donated over 6 million cups of coffee to veteran, law enforcement, and first responder causes. Their high-quality coffee beans are imported all the way from Colombia and Brazil, carefully roasted also at their facilities in Tennessee and Utah. They even have a signature roast called Lava Panther. Say it Dr. Evil style. That's directly sourced from a small farm in Guatemala. I would totally drink Lava Panther. So although the temperatures are cooling off, except they're not here in Texas, where it is 83 degrees. Actually, that is fall here. Don't forget to keep enjoying the great outdoors, fueled by Black Rifle Coffee. And the best way to do it is with the Black Rifle Coffee Club, Lava Panther. When you join, your chosen brew is roasted, packaged, and shipped free to your door. You also get a special discount, all kinds of special discounts, gain access to exclusives, and a lot more. Purchase at blackriflecoffee.com/Dana. Use code Dana at checkout for 20% off your purchase in your first Coffee Club order. The Senate's back from recess. Congress is coming back. Deadlines over everything from infrastructure to a government shutdown. Debt ceiling. Apparently, we're supposed to run out of money. The government is on September 30th. Joining us now is Louisiana Congressman Clay Higgins. Congressman, it's a pleasure to see you. Thanks so much for joining us. And I'm gonna have to get your reaction to some of the Anthony Blinken stuff as well. But I don't know if that's a bad thing if Congress ends up running out of money on September 30th. I'm not necessarily opposed to that. I realize that we got to get some things done. There's a huge fight right now over that infrastructure and the budget bill and all of this. How are you? I'll ask you this. How are you feeling? Are you optimistic about maybe stopping some of this stuff when everything goes back into session?
Well, I am an optimistic man by nature. However, that character trait is greatly challenged by the realities of D.C. and the thieves in suits that have assumed control of our nation in the halls of power in D.C. So I cannot tell you, ma'am, that I'm optimistic about the outcomes here. The majority control is in the hands of my Democrat colleagues across the aisle, and they are ruled by their extreme left, and they do not seem to care about the best interests of the American people and future generations of America. They have abandoned American strength and honor overseas. Our southern border is a disaster. The Biden administration itself has greatly weakened America, and now you're looking at the most indefensible budget presentation. Yeah, I'm an absolute no. Yeah, I'm a solid no on the infrastructure monstrosity. There's $3.5 trillion. The injury to our nation. That any conservative congressman is certainly going to be against this thing. And we're going to do all we can to stop it. So, as a regular American guy, I recall before I was in Congress, if the government shut down, we kind of liked it. Like, good, leave us alone for a little.
Yeah.
So,
I'm not opposed to that.
I want D.C. to be functional and move forward with fiscal responsibility and truly serve we the people and fulfill our oath. However, the things that I just stated that your viewers would say, well, that makes sense. Why can't everyone agree with that? It's because, most of these guys, these career politicians in D.C., they have their own little personal agenda, and they're driven by politics, and as opposed to truly serving the citizenry that we love, and therefore that's what we're faced with. And the looming shutdown of government is going to be increasingly in the American narrative, and the left will float that it's all the Republicans' fault because we just won't agree with their socialist agenda. Well, you can go ahead and carve this in stone. Some of us, constitutionalists, will never agree with their constitutionalist agenda, and we'll do everything in our power to stop it.
Congressman Higgins talking to him from the great state of Louisiana. We've had Anthony Blinken up there, Anthony Blinken testifying, and some of the stuff that he was saying, Congressman, it wasn't so much as shocking as, well, I think the naivete that he had was pretty shocking when he was talking about working with the Taliban, which he has repeatedly referred to as our quote-unquote Afghan partners. And then during the testimony, at some point it came out, we're talking about the budget and infrastructure and things that are actual not infrastructure items being paid for in this. Well, apparently we're going to be sending a lot of taxpayer dollars as aid towards what he says is essentially the de facto government there in Afghanistan, the Taliban, who just not 3 weeks ago we were bombing, going back and forth with. That doesn't seem like a wise use of taxpayer dollars. And what is your take on this? I mean, what justification do they have for this? None of that aid's going to go to any of the people there.
Well, Blinken should resign or be impeached. It's deeply shocking to actually listen to this man. You'd think he'd never read the Constitution, much less the Federalist Papers and our founding documents and truly studied the intent of our founders and came to an understanding of just how precious American freedom is and our rights and our responsibility to stand for freedom and democratic principle across the world. He's referring to the Taliban. They have been elevated in status thanks to the abandoning of $85 billion worth of modern American military equipment but overnight by the Biden administration. The State Department has been horrible to attempt to work with, as many of my colleagues have been called upon desperately to try and save Americans and American allies and Christians that were trapped in Afghanistan, most of whom remain trapped in Afghanistan through bizarre deals that we intend to investigate, some kind of abhorrent deal between our government through the State Department and Blinken with the Taliban to leave the Afghan allies that had identified as Christians on their documents, identified as following the Christian faith. They were left behind purposefully to unknown horrors. Blinken is difficult to understand just how this man came to be, Secretary of State. But we certainly know the solution. He should resign, or he should be impeached. And myself, my colleagues in the Freedom Caucus, expected to lead the fight towards impeachment for President Biden and some of his senior secretaries, including Blinken. That guy's got to go.
Yeah, there's a lot of people out there that need to go. Congressman Clay Higgins from the great state of Louisiana, sir, we appreciate your time with us today. Thanks for helping us break some of this down.
Thank you, ma'am. God bless you, and thank you for the fight that you bring to represent the American people.
Thank you. God bless.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Congressman. Coming up, a transgender MMA fighter. Now, get this. This is a guy for 30 some odd years, was a man. He served in Special Forces, U.S. Army Special Forces, beats a biological woman with a rear naked choke in an MMA bout. I wonder how he won. Keep it here. The latest evidence that we're becoming a very dumb and cowardly people is that we allow men who say that they are women to beat the hell out of women. And we call it sport and pretend like it's fair. And we even broadcast the beating so the public can cheer it on, so we can virtue signal and feel better about ourselves. So a man named Elena McLaughlin, who believes that he is a woman, defeated his opponent, Celine Provost, a biological woman. She's a woman. I'm not even going to say biological. In the second round of the Combat Global Preliminaries. Now, McLaughlin transitioned into a male after leaving U.S. Army Special Forces in 2010. Elena McLaughlin is only the second openly trans fighter after Phelan Fox to fight MMA in the U.S. Now, obviously, the victory sparked some controversy online. Why is this? Because Elena McLaughlin was a dude for 33 years before transitioning. And by the way, I use the pronouns that I use because I'm a woman and I do not allow the patriarchy to control my speech. Here's what he looked like in pictures back in 2010 when he was called Ryan. Yeah, that seems fair. Now, Elena McLaughlin has been training for more than a year in preparation for the bout, according to an outlet. McLaughlin cleared a hormone panel. Sidebar to this. I don't care what Florida State Boxing Commission wants to do. You can sit here and do testosterone repressive stuff. That does not change your bone density, your gait, your broad shoulders, your muscle mass, etc., etc., etc. Stop. We follow the science. No, the Florida State Boxing Commission, they said that passed the hormone panel, but that it was a nightmare finding an opponent for the fight. Gee, I wonder why. Maybe because no woman wants to be beaten silly in a fake competition by a guy who's cheating to win. And that's right, he's cheating. Because if a woman walked into the ring with the same level of hormones that he did, she would be disqualified for performance-enhancing drugs. Women have fought for the right to compete in sports for decades. And now, after women have managed to carve out a real space for ourselves, and now men, the patriarchy, the actual patriarchy, wants to take this away. It is amazing how much of the left's words are projections. Trans people talk all the time, people who identify as a different gender, I identify as vaccinated. Having their existence erased when people don't, they say that they don't want their existence erased when people don't acknowledge them as women or men. I'll call you whatever name you want, but you're not going to appropriate my gender, right? And I am not going to be forced by a patriarchal society to modify my speech or pronouns to accommodate your fantasy. And if that displeases you, then grow up, because there are a lot of things that displease me. For instance, some of the jeans that are coming back in style in this 90s era. But here we are as a society erasing biological women. Biological men, regardless of how much hormones they take or how many hormones they take or how much they believe that they are women. Again, bone mass, other anatomical advantages. You are not fairly competing in particularly a combat sport or any sport. It's not a fair competition against biological women. How is it that feminists, and a lot of second wave does understand this, third wave, no. Third wave, they are silent on this. And a lot of second wave actually too. I'm not even sure why this is allowed. I said up front that there's something wrong with a culture who isn't wise enough or brave enough to speak up for its daughters or its ladies. Like, where's the chivalry? This all started with the lie that there's no biological difference between men and women. I feel like this is a Gaylord Fokker conversation from Meet the Parents. Well, I have nipples, Greg, can you milk me? We let that lie persist, and here we are. Well, of course, there are differences. Follow the science. The left is always telling us this. We're trying. I mean, do we have to bloody our women at the hands of dudes to see the truth? It's amazing how so-called progressives continue to take us backwards. Re-racializing America, bringing back segregation with vax passports like in New York, erasing women's rights like the right to fair competition against other women and men competing against men. If this continues, it is. It's going to be the end of women's sports. And women won't be able to create their own leagues because they'll be called bigots if men don't get to play. And then when biological men who believe that they are women are winning all the competitions in every sport, then we'll know the truth. There always was and always will be biological differences between men and women. They matter, they're real, and they have consequences. And as a society, we must, if we care about our women, be willing to say so. Enough is enough. That does it for us tonight. Thanks for tuning in. Good night, and don't bend the knee.